Okay, so I'll start here at this side of the table. Jeff Norman is here at McMaster University. He actually has a PhD in nuclear physics, and then went back subsequently to get an MA in educational psychology. He works in the Health Sciences Center and teaches medical education and medical decision making. Beside Jeff is Pooja Agarwal, and she calls herself a public servant dedicated to bridging the gaps between education, teaching, research, and policy. She recently served as the Illinois Director for K-12 Assessment. So that was assessing 2 million students with a budget of around $43 million. So has some idea of what we need to do to educate students. You've met John. Dan Robinson is currently the director of the School of Education at Colorado State University. He is an editor of Educational Psychology Reviews and is the incoming editor for the Journal of Educational Psychology and has acted as an editor for a number of different journals. Elizabeth Marsh, at the end, and I'll come back to Bob in a second, she worked with Dr. Gordon Bauer and worked with Henry Roediger, and she's associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at Duke University. Her areas of interest are autobiographical memory, memory errors, and student learning. And then here at this end of the table is Bob York, who's the distinguished research professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of California in Los Angeles. He's edited a large number of journals, Memory and Cognition, Psych Review, the co-founding editor of Psych Science in the Public Interest, and he's the recipient of many distinguished teaching awards and Lifetime Achievement Award. So it's an excellent panel, and you're going to hear, if you come tomorrow morning, you'll hear all of them sort of speak on their areas. What I wanted to start with, just to go down the table, is in your own research. So one of the things that John talked about is this disconnect between what students do or what they think is good, or what teachers do and what they think is good, and what actually is good. So I'm wondering if in your own research, if you can come up with an example or some aspect of this disconnect between what we know is good based on evidence and what students and teachers think are good. And we can start with Bob.
Actually, my talk tomorrow morning, I actually start out with about a half a dozen cases, examples where experimental manipulations of some kinds produce one result and then students predict the opposite. So there's just a whole array of cases where, I refer to John's discussion of things like test study versus saying total time on studying. People will say that the total time on studying is better. There's just a whole array of these where people have misconceptions that sometimes just come from general beliefs they carry around with them. Sometimes they come from experiences during a task itself where poorer conditions of learning can often create a sense of fluency. Massing does that, for example, and they can confuse that sense of fluency with the actual learning. So there's a large array.
Pooja? Or Jeff? Sorry, Jeff.
I thought you were supposed to go and see.
You were.
Okay. A couple of months ago.
He's working on it.
A couple of months ago, I was giving a talk where I began with 10 assertions about learning. It was a well-informed audience. It's a bunch of people who paid a fair amount of money to go to this education conference. And I presented the assertions about learning and then asked them to create a score, which was basically to take, make it true or false. And then the score consisted of taking 10 and dividing or subtracting all of their true answers, because all of the assertions were wrong. Far and away my favorite assertion that I come up again and again and again is one of those things which seems to make such common sense, intuitive sense, and yet it's so wrong. And I know some of the people here have written about it. Learning style. Everybody loves learning style. Everybody knows whether they're a spatial or verbal learner. Everybody's read the stuff about the Colbert? No, the Myers-Briggs. It's amazing how many people have been Myers-Briggsed in the past. It's just part of our sort of culture. And yet, Bob, you've written a review article, many others have, that says this is one of the most fraudulent claims that ever. In fact, it was you who stated that basically a lot of people have made a lot of money off some of these fraudulent claims.
It's an industry.
And Richard Mayer at California has done beautiful work on the visual versus verbal, which everybody walks around. I'm a visual learner. What about you? And he showed so nicely that this is a complete crock, that it leads nowhere. So the real question is not whether teachers are bamboozled by some of these false assertions, but why are they bamboozled by some of these false assertions, and what can we do to sort of shake them out of this incredible unreality that they appear to be living in?
You're stealing my second question there,
I'm
Joe.
sorry. And by the way, I'm not apologizing for my shrubbery.
I think I would just add, in addition to what Bob said about students having assumptions about how memory and learning works and those being falsely inaccurate, and how teachers have assumptions about how learning and memory works, and those are incredibly inaccurate. I think what leads to all of that is that we make assumptions about how we learn and remember. We go through 6 to 12 years of education. Teachers go through, and they were students at one point before they became teachers, so we all feel like we learn and remember, and we kind of figure out tricks to make it through high school and college and graduate school and so on. And so there's this base of assumptions that up until recently we haven't been able to combat, or at least question. There's a whole history of very fluffy educational research, and this speaks a bit to John's point about evidence-based education, but I think as we grow in doing more and more scientifically based research in education, we can then teach students why their assumptions are wrong. They make good guesses, but there are reasons why their assumptions are wrong. And the same go for teachers, and I think a lot of that is tied up in what is translated for the public, the kind of teacher training that teachers receive. I'm a former elementary teacher, and there were no textbooks because there were just sort of no basis for what they were telling me to do as a teacher. And so I think the training and the knowledge of all of this great research needs to be extended to the public.
Go ahead, John, you can have another.
I'm not sure if I can really add another thing. Really great responses, but at least as a teacher, one thing that always, well, I guess it no longer surprises me, but when a student gets a bad grade, and then they come up afterwards and say, well, I knew all the material. Why did I get a bad grade? Well, I'm thinking, well, because you didn't know all the material? But I really do believe they believe that they've learned the material well, and it's by using some of these ineffective strategies that give the sense that I'm learning. Like, for instance, rereading. Right? When you're rereading, you go over concepts, and students might think, geez, I've seen that before. I know what that means, right? I'm going to do really well on it. Yet because they aren't using some more effective strategy to evaluate how well they're learning, like practice retrieval or something, they really get misinformed and have all these illusions about what works well. In fact, as Bob's research has shown over and over again, students think what works well are things that are easy to do, when unfortunately, learning sometimes is difficult, right? And they just have to embrace the fact and then replace these bad strategies with somewhat more effortful but more effective strategies.
There's not going to be much left for you when we get to the end. So I agree with everything that's said. I think we have to blame ourselves in terms of educational researchers at university levels. What we've been delivering to the public has been absolutely ridiculous over the last several years. And you mentioned learning strategies. The state of Colorado, we were asked recently to review some of the proposals to how we should evaluate teachers, how we should license teachers in the state of Colorado, and rather than just look at competencies in terms of, whether they can teach physics and things like that, one of the proposals was, let's evaluate some personality traits, and they proposed to use the Myers-Briggs as that evaluator. So after I read that, I went back to sleep and hoped it was a nightmare, but it wasn't. And, so my conclusion is we have to look in the mirror and we have to blame ourselves as educational researchers. These folks are in areas of cognitive psychology. I've been in colleges and schools of education all my career, and I can tell you I've been very displeased with what's been delivered in terms of here's what students should do, here's what teachers should do. We have to get better.
Okay, so I'm the last one, and I can think of maybe 2 examples where beliefs are misaligned with perhaps what would be best for people to do. And one that I don't think anyone has touched on yet involves learning from fictional materials, because a lot of educators want to incorporate movies and novels and things like that into the classroom because it's really engaging to the students. And it's a case where students really like that, but it can also, and sometimes it can be useful, but it can also lead the learner astray. For example, when they get really wrapped up in the fun plot line and don't pay attention to the science concept that they're supposed to be learning about when watching this superhero movie. And so I think we do have to be careful when thinking about using non-traditional sources in the classroom, because it comes back to this theme of what the students like isn't necessarily what's best for them. The other one I'm going to mention just really briefly, but I'm not going to tell you the answer because I want you to come to my talk tomorrow, is I'm going to talk tomorrow about student misconceptions and how students come to have errors in the knowledge base and how we correct those kind of errors. And so one of the data points that I'm going to talk about tomorrow is students' beliefs about when you should give them feedback on their homework and other assignments, and what's best for them and whether or not there's a mismatch with that. But I'm going to leave that for tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Is there any, before I move on to the next question, are there any sort of comments about what's been said? If we just keep really brief, or I can move on to the next question. Okay, in the back, nice and loud. So the question is, aren't we sort of to blame in setting up the system that allows students to cram, get the grade, move along, and so why wouldn't they do something different?
I don't think we're to blame. I think people about 120 years ago who set the system up are to blame. Now, we keep, using the same system, but there are things that individual teachers can do to help students out, like give cumulative exams at least, so students have to use better strategies, like basically relearn concepts and so forth. But I think most of us at this table, if you had your own university and could set it up in any way you wanted to, probably it would not look a lot like what we're doing today, right? With just one course kind of all embodied, and then you go move on to your other course. I would take that one course and stretch it out over 4 years, right? So a little bit over a longer period of time. But.
And there's, I think also, we get pressured as teachers into giving non-cumulative exams. And really then, to refer to another domain of research, you take an exam on one section and it acts like a forget instruction, because now you got to worry about the upcoming stuff. But these kind of things students don't like. A real genuine cumulative final actually engages the kind of relearning that John talked about. And probably preparation for that may have a longer positive long-term consequence than any other component of the course. But I just want to say it's a great point. I mean, are we putting students just, the payoff somewhere and not really where we want it to be?
Another question over here? Okay, so just to repeat the question, it has to do with Bloom's taxonomy, which has to do with levels of learning, and the idea that a lot of the research that John presented had to do with a very low sort of recall, recognition level of understanding, and didn't get into the higher levels of synthesizing knowledge and creating new knowledge based on what you had learned. And so just for the panel, what's the relation between the tools that John has talked about and these higher levels of learning, and is it the same tools, or do we need to, is there evidence on it, so on? So we can start at the end with Elizabeth.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and one that everyone at the panel would agree is an important one. I do want to say, first of all, that of course, kind of retention is the foundation. So if you don't know the basic facts, you're not going to be able to build upon them and to apply and to do that kind of creative thinking. So you have to have that first to get to those higher levels. I think that more recently, recent research has been trying to move up that Bloom's taxonomy. So for the example, the Butler study that John described is supposed to be application questions as opposed to the fact level in the Bloom's taxonomy. And then there are other studies, for example, in my lab, we do studies in engineering classrooms, signal and signal processing classrooms, and there is no memorization of facts. It's all problem solving. So it's all taking this knowledge and applying it in new situations. So I think that we need a lot more research on this, but I think we have confidence that it's something that is not limited just to fact learning.
So I actually spent, it's a great question, I had the exact same one. And as a former teacher and as a researcher, I had that question, and so I spent 2 years of my life trying to get at that question in my dissertation that will be published at some point. And I essentially took what John described about retrieval practice, and one, I wanted to look at, can we extend this research and see if retrieval practice will help with synthesis, creation, analysis. And two, a lot of research in retrieval practice so far has maybe, for instance in the Butler study, has maybe used sort of fact-based questions during the quizzing or during your retrieval practice. What if you use higher order questions during retrieval practice, and how does that affect both lower and higher order learning? And briefly, because I'm not going to talk about it tomorrow, my findings were that retrieval practice is much better than restudying, replicated that finding. And in both instances, if you conducted retrieval practice with lower order fact concept-based questions, that improved your retention of fact and concept ideas. If you did retrieval practice with higher order questions that are, in my opinion, way beyond some of the stuff that Andrew Butler did, then that improves your higher order skills a week or a month later. So there is not a whole lot of research on it yet, but I think it's growing, and I'd like to say that I think I did one study to help answer that. Of course, we need more research, but I think it is possible that retrieval practice, distributed practice, successive relearning apply to a variety of ages, a variety of materials, and a variety of thinking and analysis.
In health sciences, we're kind of preoccupied with the notion that our students should be able to learn these basic science concepts and then apply them to patient problems, so that's fairly central to our focus. As it turns out, there are two people in the audience, both of whom I had the privilege to supervise in their PhDs, who have explicitly studied the notion of interleaved practice, one in nursing and the other in medicine, where explicitly what students are learning is very, very difficult concepts like Laplace's law and Starling's law, and showing that in fact these kind of science of learning strategies also work very effectively in terms of their being able to apply those difficult concepts to practical clinical situations.
I just might add one point, which these are really good points, it's a good question. We shouldn't forget there are these interactions among the levels, namely almost any field of science, other kind of domains, there's a vocabulary to learn, which I don't mean vocabulary like foreign language. There's classifications, categorizations, all of that, and a lot of that becomes the foundation for the higher order thing. And there's an interesting result, Washington University by a postdoctoral fellow there, Jerry Little, working with Mark McDaniel, which looked at memorization of key terms in a course and just did a kind of counterbalancing where they do retrieval practice on half of them and not on the others, and then another group did the retrieval practice on the other. And what they found was that there were benefits on the final exam, questions that dealt, the people who had practiced half the term did better on the other terms. So simply having some of the vocabulary, this is biochemistry or something like that, then enabled their learning in other domains. So it kind of goes, there's a back and forth thing, and I think sometimes we'd like our students, particularly maybe in lower grades or something, to be answering at a conceptual level or whatever, where they don't have the tools at the next lower level.
And just kind of an advertisement for the big review that we did, the 3 strategies that were ranked as moderate utility are largely focused on the conceptual level of analysis. And they were ranked moderate utility only because there's not yet, for our preference, not enough data to show that they actually work in the classroom. I'm convinced they're going to work in the classroom. I'm convinced they're going to help students improve their conceptual understanding of materials. We just need to study them more often. In fact, one of those strategies is the interleaving strategy that was just mentioned, and it really is effective. If you would like to learn more about these strategies, please write me, and I'll send you the monograph and a couple spin-off articles that describes them in more detail.
Okay, I want to move on to a second question, or class of questions. Rather than talking about what the disconnections are, a little bit more about, well, why do we think those disconnects are there? So we had some inclination that we're teaching students bad strategies, but why do you think students stick with these strategies or don't come up with new strategies? And more critically, what can the average educator or chair of a department or dean or president of a university do to change the status quo in terms of these poor connections between what students are doing and what we know will work better? So it's a broad question, but really it's, why do you think students are doing what they're doing, and what can we do to put them on a better path at any level of university administration? So I'm going to put Elizabeth on the hot spot because she got last time. She'll get to go first this time.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm going to answer all parts of that question, but one thing I will note is that when we were working on the PSPI monograph, we got our educational psychologist on the author list to tell us what the top ed psych textbooks were, and then we went and surveyed in the ed psych textbooks to see what they had to say about these techniques. And what was really striking was that there was actually not very much coverage in the ed psych textbook. I recently met with the director of the program of education at Duke, and he confirmed that in their ed psych class, they don't spend a lot of time on this kind of thing. And so, there are data from developmental data that the way that teachers talk about memory to young children has impacts for how they perform in classrooms. And so if the ed psych textbooks aren't really presenting the full information that educators need to know, and that in turn it means that what they're conveying to students may not be the most useful. I think that could be, I wouldn't want to blame that for all of the problem, but I would think that could be one part of it.
I'll build off that, since my students and I also did a study where we looked at educational psychology textbooks and teacher method textbooks. This is about 5 years ago, and we tried to look in the learning chapters, learning studies, strategy chapters, and we looked at the types of advice that were given to students and teachers, and then we looked to see what types of sources were used to support those kernels of advice. And we found that over 2/3 were secondary sources, came from books, book chapters. Only 20% or less came from experimental studies, intervention type studies. So again, much of the literature base that our students are basing this on, or at least being taught, is not being based on studies that would infer causation. The other thing, and these folks are obviously more qualified than I am to make assumptions about this, but perhaps one of the reasons why our students don't buy into these and adopt ineffective strategies is that they don't really stop to think about long-term memory and instead focus more on the short term. Can I recall it right now? And Bob has talked about desirable difficulties, and desirable difficulties is really about making things desirably difficult that pay off in the long run as opposed to short run. Sometimes they're actually worse when you're tested immediately. So perhaps we need to get our students to think more long term. Can I remember this 2 days from now, or a week from now, or a month from now, as opposed to can I remember it right now if I use a strategy?
Now, part of this is, I think the onus is on the teachers. When I teach, I actually start teaching differently to stress the use of some of these effective strategies. And what I mean by this is that when I first was a young assistant professor, of course, everything in the cognitive psychology textbook was equally important. The students should learn it all, right? They embrace it like I did. I'll say that's a bit ridiculous, right? What I've done is just decided to pull out the most critical components of that class, what the students really need to take with them, and then in like at least how I deliver the material, I'm spacing the content, the same content throughout the entire class. So I'm teaching a lot less content, but then they have a chance to basically retain a lot more. And I think for getting, it's going to be tough for many teachers to do this, right? Because it's like, well, I got to tell them about this, I need to tell them about that. Well, what happens, they get exposed to so much that again, after the semester-long course, they're just not retaining any of it, right? So I think we can make part of the change by actually structuring our classes different, expecting them to learn a little bit less, but to learn it really well. And I think once they have the efficacy experiences of like learning this and using the right strategies, some students at least will adopt better techniques.
I guess I would just add that students aren't adopting these strategies because what they're doing works. They get rewarded for cramming and doing well on a test. They get rewarded for cramming and doing well on a test and getting A's in college. They get rewarded for cramming, doing well on a state standardized test, and then the teacher's happy because the teacher or the school or the district has good scores, and then the kids forget everything. And so I think going back to the earlier point, I agree with everything here, and then I think the next step is to start rethinking how to change these systems. How do we change what the incentive is for students to learn? So not just in the individual classroom for a teacher to give weekly quizzes and a cumulative exam, but maybe in K-12 there is, and there's no research to support this yet, but maybe K-12 needs to be more of, not you take math, science, English in 3rd grade, and then you take math, science, English in 4th grade, and so on, and you have different teachers, and they cover different content, and again, maybe these courses, grades, K-12, college, medical education should just be structured differently. So you're no longer taking an exam and moving on. You're not taking step 1 as a medical student and moving on. And everything should sort of just be distributed over time. And so I think changing and rethinking what those incentives are would make a big difference.
Let me take a bit of an institutional perspective on the nature of the problem. I think the problem is that we've discovered the enemy and it's us. I go back to when I went to Michigan State in the late 70s, and that was my only claim to legitimacy. So now that I can say I have a master's in educational psychology and a PhD, and everybody assumes it's in educational psychology, which of course it isn't. I was really excited to go there because it was the top school in the country at that point. I studied with the likes of Lee Shulman, who many will know as one of the stars in education. And I was so excited because I was really going to learn how people learn. And I took a course from Shulman called Theories of Learning. And it taught me about Ausubel and how the teacher should organize things in advance. And it taught me about Gagne and learning hierarchies. And as I reflected on it, all that was telling me what the teacher should be doing, not what the students should be doing. I was finding out about teaching, not learning. And as I puzzled as to why that might be the case, it dawned on me that I was on the wrong side of the campus. And Michigan State is a very big campus with 45,000 students back then. I was in the Department of Educational Psychology, which resided in the Faculty of Education. And I should have been in the Department of Psychology that resided in the Faculty of Science. Now you could say, well, that's 40 years ago and it's not like that now. But I did notice as we were going through the talk, as John was going through the talk today, I was looking in the bottom right corner and seeing where those studies were published. And I didn't do an accurate count, but I'm pretty sure about 3/4 of them were in Journal of Experimental Psychology, this, that, or the other thing, and 1/4 were in Journal of Educational Psychology. In other words, I think we psychologists, and I recently started calling myself one, I think we're spending a lot of time talking to other of us psychologists, and we're not really connecting with the teachers. One last kick, recently I had the privilege of being in Australia, and I gave a talk at Flinders about science of learning because I am an apostle of the Bjorks and the Rodingers of the world. I think it's just amazing. And then this guy asked a question afterward and said, I go over to the Faculty of Education and they're not interested in any of this stuff. Why is that? And I sort of said, well, just what I just said now, not knowing that there were 3 people from the Faculty of Education in the audience. However, I did get out alive. But I think that's a serious problem, that certainly I don't connect, we don't even have a faculty of education. Perhaps that's an advantage here at McMaster, I'm not sure. But we seem to have two solitudes that aren't talking to each other very much. Bob, of course, is the exception to that.
So I think one reason we don't understand how to learn better is, and we kind of walk around with what I think of as kind of just a faulty mental model of how we learn, is just the fact that we're very susceptible to being fooled by our current performance. Dan sort of referred to this, but the distinction between learning performance goes back to the 1930s and animal research, and basically the absolute conclusion from that research is that during the acquisition process, performance is what we can look at and measure. Learning that will support long-term performance and transfer, we have to try to infer. And the problem is that without even thinking about it, teachers who are looking at their students' performance, or a performer looking at his own performance or her own performance, can assume that it is a reliable measure of learning. And the whole desirable difficulties domain is a set of techniques that appear to create challenges and slow down gains in performance during the acquisition process, and then enhance long-term learning memory. And it's a very large body. Dr. Nick Soderstrom and I, Nick's in the audience somewhere, just completed for Oxford Bibliographies a bibliography on learning versus performance in the skills and verbal learning domain that does go back to the 1930s. And basically, we're susceptible to being fooled, because a lot of things that make us blocking practice or whatever, that make us improve rapidly in a performance sense, fail to support long-term retention and learning. So even the most well-intentioned students who are not after grades, who value learning more than anything else, can be confused by current performance. And teachers, often that's what they see. At one point, I chaired a panel of the National Research Council on enhancing human performance, where it was funded by the Army, and we visited lots of military locations, look at the training there. And what the people responsible for training saw is performance during training. They never saw what was done later when it mattered. Didn't get any feedback from that. So if you're going to be guided by what you just see locally during training of a procedure or skill or verbal conceptual knowledge, you will get fooled as to how to optimize that learning.
So I can take one or two questions from the audience on this topic. Yeah. Okay, so if I summarize the question, essentially what you're saying is that we've been using the same tools for probably 1,000 years in terms of the lecture, and so the question is, how can we use technology to steer students in the right direction in terms of study skills? Are there tools out there, or do we need to invent better tools? And so the question is, can technology solve some of our problems? And I'll start in the middle.
Yeah, start in the middle.
John.
So your question is, can technology help students? My answer is yes, of course it can. Like for instance, the research I was just presenting today relied heavily on technology, because I wasn't truthful about everything I said, okay? So when I'm, for instance, talking about students should go until they can correctly retrieve information from memory. And then when they correctly retrieve it, then they no longer have to study it again, such as for the introductory psychology course research I was showing. What I didn't tell you is how we evaluated whether they correctly recalled that information. And it turns out that students said whether they correctly recalled it or not. And one difficulty is that often we find when students are evaluating their own knowledge, like, do I understand and am I recalling this concept correctly? They're horrible. So they recall something that's absolutely incorrect, and then they think they're absolutely correct. So what technology needs to do is basically solve these kinds of problems. How can we scaffold use a variety of different technologies to help them evaluate the quality of their knowledge. I think that could be done. We solved that problem for this kind of concept, but I think we need to make the same headways using technology in many other areas. I know there's a lot of research that's utilizing technology in the classroom. Admittedly, I'm not familiar with most of that, so
Elizabeth is
Yeah,
chomping
no,
at the bit to.
I'm excited, sorry. I think it's a great question, and there are multiple levels of answers. But one thing I think that it's important to consider with technology is that students like it, first of all, and that can be a way to reach students, and it can have a very broad reach. Like when you look at MOOCs, for example, they reach people around the globe. And I think that the infrastructure is being developed for technology interventions. You mentioned intelligent tutoring systems. The issue with intelligent tutoring systems is that they're phenomenally expensive to build and tend to be domain specific. So what I think we need are uses of technology that are simpler and can be transferred across domains. You can pull up your iPhone and find tons of apps for flashcards on how to do retrieval practice. I'm going to talk tomorrow about a cyber learning system that I'm building with engineers at Rice, where we're trying to implement these principles of retrieval practice and spacing and feedback in a system that anyone can use to have their students do their homework that way, because you're exactly right. The teacher can't necessarily be keeping track of, you do this problem and you do that problem, or you wait this long and someone else waits that long. It has to be automated, but that automation, which is a lot of people are working on right now, really has to be based on principles of cognitive science. And so, just because some places are promising personalized learning doesn't mean that it's good personalized learning. So I think it's an important problem and one that there's a lot of work going on right now.
Jeff?
Better learning through technology is a bit like the old line about better living through chemistry, and that's a bit general for my tastes. I mean, it's hard to imagine that mustard gas gave anybody better living, but it was chemistry. I think we have to be very careful in what we mean by technology. We in health sciences, again, have the luxury of perhaps too much money to spend on education, although I'm sure Rob would disagree. But one of the ways we spend it is on very expensive technologies, simulations. I think we now have in our shop a $100,000 plastic body which simulates heart sounds. And I've done the study that shows that that's every bit as equivalent to a $1 CD. So I think we have to be much more careful about technology, and in general we've looked at simulation fairly carefully in health sciences and found that what you can get for $100,000 you can generally get 95% of it for $10. The best study was one which was a cystoscopy simulator, which compared a $5,000 plastic pelvis effectively to a McDonald's coffee cup and 2 plastic drinking straws, and showed no difference. So one has to be a little bit more specific when we talk about the potential benefits and costs, both physical and otherwise, of technology.
Pooja?
I would say, as John said, can technology help student learning? Yes. Does technology always help student learning? Probably not. I don't know if there are any experimentally controlled large-scale experiments or studies on whether, let's say, a kid gets a laptop, do they learn more than a kid without a laptop? And yet the entire state of Maine gave laptops to every student in the state. And the entire Los Angeles school district bought iPads for every student in LA. And as far as I know, going back to John's point again, where is the evidence that that helps? Just putting an iPad in a student's hand may teach them how to play Angry Birds, and it's really neat when a 3-year-old can do that, but it doesn't mean improved outcomes for students or learning or the economy. So I'm a bit skeptical. I think technology is great, but I don't think iPads and smart boards and video lectures are necessarily going to fix anything unless they're done thoughtfully and correctly.
I guess I think we need to learn how to do it in the sense that more and more learning is moving outside the classroom and into our own hands, and optimizing self-regulated learning and knowing how to learn. It's always been a survival skill. It's probably more important now than ever before. And but Jeff's point about high technology, I mean, had occasion to look at simulators a while back, and there are some dramatic examples. I remember another one teaching strategic military planning. One that used a board and popsicle sticks was better than $1 million simulator. And in fact, a lot of that lined up, and it's relevant to our sort of research, is it turns out to be the psychological fidelity of simulators, not the engineering fidelity. You make them early on in learning, for example, too many levers, buttons, whistles, whatever other forces can impede the learning process. So it's a rich domain all by itself for learning research. But I think Beth's mentioned and others mentioned all the things that are happening. I think it's just changing the world directions very rapidly, hard to predict, but I see great potential if only, again, these technological devices can be informed by the relevant science.
Dan, do you want to have the last
I'm
word?
the only one that hasn't commented, so I have to say something, otherwise I appear anti-technology or pro-technology. Rich Mayer wrote on this and talked about when television was first introduced, everyone thought how that was going to revolutionize education. It didn't. When microcomputers came on the scene, it was supposed to revolutionize education. It didn't. What has revolutionized education? I'm still looking, and it sickens me when I hear that schools and states are spending money on iPads, computers, fancy labs. It's window dressing. There's nothing going on, it's window dressing. So I think it's got great potential. Again, where's the evidence? Let's do some studies, let's find something that works.
So just before we thank our panelists and our speaker, I'd like to thank a couple of people that made everything possible today and tomorrow. So from the President's Office, Mary Cozio has been instrumental in getting everything together. From Alumni Office, Christine Kennedy. From PNB, Michelle Kajua and Irina Gillick. Have really put everything together, and I don't know if you've seen all the people in black shirts, but there's a team of volunteers working behind the scenes to make everything really come off really well. And I hope you'll join us tomorrow when we'll hear again from the speakers more specifically about their research. And so I'd like to thank all the speakers and the panelists and for you for coming.